The river was supposed to be peaceful that autumn afternoon, but rivers have a way of betraying expectations. Sarah Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Technologies and one of Forbes's most powerful women under 40, hadn't expected the current to grab her like hungry hands when she stepped on that moss-covered rock. She hadn't expected the cold water to fill her lungs as she went under. And she certainly hadn't expected that the man who would save her life would be wearing paint-stained jeans and carrying a 6-year-old superhero lunchbox. Jake Torres had been walking home from the parent-teacher conference, his daughter Emma's hand in his, when he heard the splash. Some instincts you can't ignore, even when they terrify you. Even when you're a single dad whose daughter has already lost one parent and can't afford to lose another. But Jake didn't think about that. He just ran. The water was frigid, shocking his system as he dove in. Sarah was already going under for the second time, her designer blazer weighing her down like an anchor. Jake reached her just as she slipped beneath the surface again, his contractor's calloused hands finding her arm and pulling with everything he had. The current fought him, but Jake had spent years working construction, and his body knew how to fight back. When he finally dragged her to the shore, she was coughing up river water, shaking violently, her perfectly styled blonde hair plastered to her face. Emma stood on the bank, tears streaming down her cheeks, clutching her father's jacket that he'd thrown off before jumping in. "You're okay," Jake kept repeating, his own teeth chattering. "You're okay now." Sarah looked up at him through bleary eyes, seeing a man she'd never forget, strong jaw, dark eyes filled with concern, and soaking wet from head to toe because he'd saved a complete stranger. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "Thank you." What Sarah didn't know then was that Jake had just paid for his daughter's asthma medication instead of fixing his truck. That he worked 2 jobs to keep Emma in a good school district. That diving into that river meant his only pair of work boots were ruined, and he couldn't afford new ones until next Friday. Jake called 911, and the ambulance came quickly. As the paramedics wrapped Sarah in warming blankets and checked her vitals, she insisted on getting his information. "Please," she said, her voice still hoarse. "I need to thank you properly." Jake was reluctant, but Emma, ever the helper, recited their address with pride. "We live at 847 Maple Street, apartment 2B. Daddy says it's cozy, but I call it our castle." Sarah smiled despite everything, and something in her chest that had nothing to do with the river water shifted. She watched this man comfort his daughter, assuring her that he was fine, that everything was fine, all while standing there soaked and shivering in 40-degree weather. 3 days later, Jake answered a knock at his door to find Sarah Mitchell standing there, looking nothing like the drowning woman he'd pulled from the river. She wore an elegant cream-colored suit, her hair styled perfectly, her presence commanding even in the narrow hallway of his modest apartment building. "Mr. Torres," she said, and he noticed her voice was still slightly raspy. "May I come in?" Jake let her in, suddenly conscious of the mismatched furniture, the toys scattered across the living room floor, the leak in the ceiling he'd been meaning to fix. But Sarah didn't seem to notice any of it. Her eyes were locked on his. "I came to thank you properly," she said. "And to ask you something that might sound completely insane." Jake crossed his arms, wary now. "Okay." Sarah took a breath, and Jake saw something vulnerable beneath her CEO armor. "Do you believe that crisis reveals who people truly are? That when we're stripped down to nothing, when we're drowning, literally or figuratively, that's when we see clearly?" "I suppose," Jake said slowly. "That river stripped everything away from me," Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly. "My title, my power, my control. I was just a human being about to die, and you saved me without knowing who I was, without expecting anything in return. You just saved me." She stepped closer, and Jake could see tears gathering in her eyes. "I've spent 10 years building my company," she said. 10 years being the smartest person in every room, making the tough calls, never showing weakness. And then I nearly died, and a single father working 2 jobs jumped into a freezing river without hesitation." She laughed, but it was edged with something like wonder. "Do you know what I thought about while I was under that water?" Jake shook his head. "I thought about how empty my life has become. How I have everything, money, success, recognition, and nothing that matters. No one who would jump into a river for me, not really. Employees, yes. Business partners. But no one who would risk everything without calculating the return on investment. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, but she didn't hand it to him yet. "I could write you a check," she said. "A big one. That's what most people would expect. But I don't think that's what this is about, is it?" Jake felt his heart pounding. "I don't want your money." "I know," Sarah whispered. "That's exactly why I need to ask you this, even though it's crazy, even though we barely know each other." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was raw with honesty. "Will you turn away if I undress? Not physically, I mean, will you turn away if I take off all these layers of build-up? If I show you who I really am beneath the title and the armor? Because I think you might be the only person who's seen me truly vulnerable and didn't try to exploit it." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with a significance that went beyond words. Jake understood what she was really asking. Not for romance, not yet, but for something more fundamental: permission to be human. Permission to be imperfect. A safe place to be vulnerable in a world that had taught her vulnerability was weakness. "Everyone deserves to be seen," Jake said quietly. "The real them, not the version they think the world needs." Sarah's tears finally spilled over. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be anything other than the CEO. I don't know how to connect with people without agendas and strategies." "Then maybe start by being honest," Jake offered. "What do you actually want?" Sarah looked around his small apartment, at the photos of Emma on the walls, at the evidence of a life lived with love despite financial struggle. "I want what you have. Not the apartment or the circumstances, but the authenticity. The purpose. You jumped in that river because it was the right thing to do, not because of what you'd gain. When was the last time I did anything purely because it was right?" Over the following weeks, an unlikely friendship formed. Sarah came to Jake's apartment, not as a CEO but as a woman learning to be human again. She met Emma, who was delighted to have a princess friend, who ran a whole company. Sarah helped Emma with her science project. Jake taught Sarah how to make spaghetti from scratch instead of having it catered. And slowly, Sarah began to understand what she'd been missing. The simple joy of making a child laugh. The satisfaction of fixing something with your own hands. The peace of sitting in comfortable silence with someone who expected nothing from you but honesty. The river had stripped everything away, but what Jake had given her back was so much more valuable: the courage to be vulnerable, the permission to be imperfect, and the understanding that true strength isn't about never falling, it's about the people who choose to pull you back to shore. When Sarah finally asked Jake if he'd consider letting her be part of his and Emma's life, really part of it, she wasn't a CEO making a business proposal. She was just a woman who'd nearly drowned and found salvation in the kindness of a stranger who'd expected nothing in return. And Jake, who'd spent years building a life for his daughter on faith and determination, recognized something rare: someone who'd been given everything and chosen to value the only things that truly matter. Sometimes the river takes everything away. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, someone jumps in after you and shows you what was worth saving all along.